Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the, 7th of July 2025, and that is makes it an 8-day Frontline update. That's a long time since I've done an update, so you can imagine there will be quite a lot of change to the front lines. Quite a lot of red or pucil pink pins. That suggests that's been movement from the previous positioning of the Russian defensive lines to the present positioning, as according to the two mappers I use, Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy maps. Dnipropetrovsk has the lighter coloured pins. Light blues suggest that, as according to him, the Ukrainians have pushed forward from previous positions, and the light pink suggests that the Russians have pushed forward from previous positions. The darker ones refer to Sumy maps. Okay, let's go to this northern area around Sumy, or north of Sumy, whereby the Ukrainians are supposedly pushing the Russians back to some degree. Sumy maps has the Russians pushing the Ukrainians back towards the border in the Tetkino area. I haven't heard too much from Tetkino recently. That might well be the case. I don't know. Not agreed to by Dnipropetrovsk, but there is that claim from Sumy maps. And then coming down to north of Sumy at around the Oleksivka, Kindrativka, just northwest of Andriivka, the Ukrainians having some marginal gains there, not really an awful lot. Likewise, up towards Konstantinivka there too. What do we have to say? So Visioner said, and some of these, remember this is an 8-day update, so some of these will be a good few days old. This is yesterday. Russian forces are retreating from villages they had occupied in the Sumy region due to the unbearable conditions there, according to Russian military correspondents. After suffering heavy losses enduring several days of operational encirclement and facing a dire situation, Russian units managed to flee from the villages of Kindrativka and Oleksivka in Sumy. These villages are now under the control of the Ukrainian forces. So that's a claim there. That is to say that Kindrativka and Oleksivka are under the control of the Ukrainians, not under the control of the Russians. So that's a real difference actually to both mappers here. Although Dnipropetrovsk has the Russians push further back in Kindrativka, the claim is that the Russians are no longer in these two villages. We'll see if that's the case, I guess, as the days continue. What else do we have? The airfield advanced near Oleksivka. So this is actually from the 29th. This is going back 8 days that the Ukrainians advanced just south of Oleksivka there. No, into, yes, Oleksivka. So, yeah, that was the claim some time ago. And the airfield have cleared Yablunivka, and that was Grayskull about 4 days ago. So Yablunivka is just along here. That village has been cleared according to that particular mapper, that source. Neither of my two mappers have claimed similarly, but it could well be that Ukrainians do have had more success in Sumy. Now, we did hear, I reported this on my hits and losses videos, that there have been convoys of vehicles, a convoy of 20 vehicles going from Zaporozhye area along to Taganrog to go up to Sumy to help support the troops in Sumy. So the Russians under a lot of pressure there. They are supposedly going backwards. Now, the convoy was in largely sort of gazelles and buses and whatnot, not military equipment, and it supposedly included Roskvardia and troops from the Caucasus as well. If they included Roskvardia, those are your riot police from interior services. That could indicate that Russians are struggling for troops, that they're taking from troops in the Zaporozhye area, which is another area the Russians have been rumored to be attacking from at some point. That could be a source of their what would be a belated summer offensive. This could indicate desperate situations for the Russians as they're putting troops, and not particularly military troops, from there up to Sumy. So good news for the Ukrainians, I guess, in that respect. Then when we come along to Belgorod, some slight movements for the Russians there. Just seeing if I didn't have anything else. Oh, actually I do have, Yablunivka. No, I did talk about that. So slight gains for the Russians in the Vovchansk area, but that is Dnipropetrovsk agreeing with what Surat Maps have previously said in the middle of their... In fact, Andrew previously told me on a live stream that basically the Ukrainians have been pushed back south of that river there. So it's unlikely that the Ukrainians hold too much of that land. Anyway, and there are rumours that worries that the Russians have opened up another axis, really, or another point on the northern border coming into Kharkiv Oblast. Here we have around Myrnohrad, the Russians apparently making a set of gains southwest of the border, moving into Kharkiv from another direction. That is definitely a worry. You don't want the Russians to be the ones operating with initiative and causing the Ukrainians to have to react to what the Russians are doing. You want to wrest the initiative off the other side. Ukraine wants to do that because they want to be forcing the Russians to make choices. You know, you don't want solutions, you want dilemmas. You don't want problems, you want dilemmas. Problems are issues that demand a solution. But you can solve a problem. With dilemmas, you don't solve them, you go opt for the least worst option. Each side wants to be creating scenarios that are dilemmas for the other side. Okay, then when we go to the Kupiansk sector, you can see that according to Surat Maps, the Russians making some more gains really far north, right next to the Russian border there. Interestingly, no change around Kupiansk, which was looking a bit hairy. The Russians have made some gains north of the settlement, but they seem to have stopped in their tracks to some degree. And actually there are claims of regained land in this whole kind of general area, mainly down in the Pischany sector. So if we come down past Kupiansk, past this whole kind of area where the Ukrainians still have fairly substantial control here, come down to what I call the Pischany sector, the Ukrainians making some gains north of Pischany itself. That is just here. You can see that this mapping interpretation is very different to what we have on mine, where you've got both mappers agreeing that some land here is controlled by the Russians, and then Surat Maps has the Russians controlling a lot more on top of that. But this mapper that I'm referring to here doesn't have any of that area controlled by the Russians. In fact, it is that area that the Ukrainians have retaken themselves. Ukrainian forces have successfully cleared several forested areas north of Pischany in the Kupiansk direction. These positions have previously been part of the grey zone. So Vision are saying that this wasn't Russian controlled, it was grey zone. Both mappers on my map seem to indicate that the Russians had some kind of grey zone, some kind of control. It wasn't just grey zone. But as according to Surat Maps, the Russians are right the way north there, going into some tree lines between a couple of fields there. But you can see Tabaivka just over here, Tabaivka, and just to the left of that, you have Ukrainian gains. So that is suggesting that all of this area has been regained by the Ukrainians. That was from July the 1st, though, and we're now on July the 7th, and there's been no change to these two mappers. So it might have been short-lived, it might have been retaken by the Russians. Now, there is some change as we go further to the west here, around Klishkivka and this Kolesnikivka there. If we look at the next set of maps, you've got that bit that sticks out. And just to the east of that, an area that the Ukrainians have successfully counterattacked into. Ukrainian Armed Forces regaining several more positions east of Kolesnikivka. So there, this is where the Ukrainians making some gains. Surat Maps indicating that, yeah, the Russians have been pushed back in that area, although the Russians might have also gained a little bit on that sort of bridgehead over here. So slightly different maps there, but yeah, you get the picture. Indeed, this is confirmed, or talked about again at a different point. So that's further to the east, then right next to Kolesnikivka there in the Kupiansk direction, gains for the Ukrainians. Then this is mentioned by Grayskull, the AFU advance east of Kolesnikivka in the Kupiansk direction. Okay, so that's there. Then we are going to come round to the bottom of this sector where the Ukrainians have been pushing fairly well. They've had a slightly better time around here than they have in many other places along the front line. Ukrainians pushing the Russians back in the Lazova area previously on previous mapping updates, and all around here it's been talked about that the Russian defences are really kind of veneer deep, as they might be in a number of places along the front line, but the problem is the Ukrainians are very short on personnel, and so it's as if the defence is very vulnerable, but the attack is kind of non-existent, so you can have vulnerable defences. But anyway, in this area that's just south of Kryliakivka, we've got Zaporozhye there. As we get back to that, Ukrainians liberated Zaporozhye, as it's transcribed here. Some of these places have different ways of saying them, but you can see that the interpretation of the mapping around there is very different. It might be the old tree line the Russians control to the east, but actually, both mappers seem to suggest that this settlement is no longer under the control of the Russians. So good job by the Ukrainians there. Okay, then we have the Ukrainians advancing in Novahirivka. And after we sort of finish here, there won't be too much joy for the Ukrainians compared to what the Russians are doing and the amount of land they have taken. But Surat map suggesting that around Novahirivka, the Ukrainians have made some gains. Remember, this is the site of their original push towards Borova over here and the Oskil River as it comes down from the north. So there we have a good set of gains there for the Ukrainians, as according to Grayskull, including going into Novahirivka, it appears. So there we go. Just see if there is how far that goes back. So I presume this is going to be, it's difficult because I'm not quite sure what's grey zone here. I presume this darker area is grey zone, and then the lighter stuff is Russian controlled area. So anyway, it looks like the Russians have been pushed back there. Okay, then when we come down to the Toretsk, Toretsk area, although it's a lot further north here. You've got Toretsk down here and Toretsk just to the south. So I don't know what sector we call this, but it's certainly one where the Russians are seeking to push ever westwards. And according to Surat maps, not according to Andrew Perpetua, so a completely different interpretation of what's going on around here. Andrew Perpetua showing no gains for the Russians whatsoever. Surat maps saying that they are gaining on in every area of this sector. We look at some of the other mappers. We've got a sense that the Ukrainians might be pushing back in a couple of places, Novi Mir in the Lyman direction. So we have Novi Mir there. We look at Novi Mir on my map. Novi Mir is partially controlled by the Russians, and then below that, very much controlled. Well, according to this particular map, actually there's no Russian control until south of here. So the Russian control, all of this is not true, as according to this other mapping source, of course. That is Surat maps, very pro-Russian mapper, could well be responding to claims from the Ministry of Defense. Reality could be very different. And here's the Ukrainians are continuing to advance in Rydkudub in the Lyman direction, and that is here. So if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that Surat maps agrees that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians all the way back here to the east of the settlement. And indeed, just north of there is some land that's controlled. But slightly different map interpretation from all the mappers here. And then we're really going to be getting on to challenges for the Ukrainians, as according to Surat maps, the Ukrainians are making some fairly consistent gains going eastwards towards that Oskil River area and towards indeed the settlement of Oskil, but which is over there. Definitely a worry for the Ukrainians to get that much land gained in 8 days, and a little bit more, according to Surat maps at least, land taken along the Sversky Donetsk River, and this is a bit of a worry. as the Russians are looking to approach Seversk from the north as well as from the east. And Seversk is in a lot of trouble. There's kind of talk that they are bracing for the kind of beginning of the end, the Russian liberation of what is a fairly major settlement in the area. This is something that the Ukrainians were not wanting the Russians to be able to take, but as they inch themselves forward, and as the natural barrier of this chalk pit over here and the mountains up here, as the Russians have been able to take that, they are seemingly marching on with a lot greater speed, although there's a huge difference between the two mappers, between Dnipropetrovsk's light blue line there and the orange of Suryat maps. Just huge difference of opinion with regard to what the Russians are in control of. Anyway, as we come further to the south, we have a bit of a problem here, and that is that Chasiv Yar seems to be in a spot of bother, at least according to Suryat maps. Really significant gains both north and south of Chasiv Yar. This is a town that was supposed to be taken by the Russians last summer, but the Ukrainians have held on magnificently, but it does look like it is definitely very challenging for the Ukrainians there. And if Suryat maps is to be believed, then the Ukrainians are in a lot of trouble there. And then that makes Konstantinivka more vulnerable. Then you're thinking about Kramatorsk, as you're getting artillery closer to there, Druzhkivka down here, Sloviansk, and then the Russians are advancing on Seversk. So this whole area is becoming a really significant concern, I think, for the Ukrainians, as the Russians are just piling on the pressure both north and east and southeast and south of these places. So yeah, real worries for the Ukrainians. Okay, what else do we have? Just have a look at some of my sources, remind us where we're at. Toretsk, Delivka area. Ukrainians have fought back a little bit there in Delivka, so that is suggesting that this area, the Ukrainians could be having some success, although there are two kind of Delivkas here. I think this one north is probably likely the culprit. So the Ukrainians have cleared Delivka in the Toretsk direction, but that was 8 days ago now, right after I just done my last update. And you do wonder whether the Russians have retaken Delivka, as both mappers show that, both mappers show some gains in this area. Only Suryat map shows Delivka under Russian control. And then we come further around the sector here, and a bit of a mixed bag. Ukraine is pushing back in a couple of places, but really being very much under the cosh. They've liberated Mikhailivka and Myrnohrad in the Myrnohrad direction, according to Grayskull. So the Ukrainians still pushing in a few places here. Let's go and find those on the map. Yeah, so that's down here in this blue ringed area, the blue pins of Suryat maps showing that the Ukrainians have pushed back on the southern part of that Pokrovsk area. But generally, it's not looking good for the Ukrainians, as the Russians are pushing further to the west, moving on through Shevchenko and then over to Kopcheve and just onwards and onwards. Real concern there for the sorry, I'm just getting myself a little bit lost, for the Ukrainians. So yeah, this is the area where the Russians got across the junction here, across the road, the T0504 highway coming down from Konstantinivka through to indeed eventually Pokrovsk. It's here that the Russians have got across there using motorbikes very heavily in this sector, and then moving further to the north of Myrnohrad so that they can effectively encircle Myrnohrad and indeed Pokrovsk. And you can see them starting to think about closing this cauldron, or first of all turning it into a cauldron. Remember, previously it was kind of going across there all the way over to there. And now with that move to the north, they're controlling all of this area, and it means that they can flank the two settlements, Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, and that could spell the end of those in terms of remaining in Ukrainian hands. So yeah, so many concerns right around this map. The advanced northeast of Myrnohrad is particularly concerning, says Rob Lee, as Russian FPV teams can place logistics routes on to Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad at greater risk. According to the map, Russian forces are less than 20 kilometers from Dnipropetrovsk. So really what Rob Lee is saying there is that these roads that feed from the north, particularly into Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, these are under a lot of pressure from the Russians as they are moving forward further and further. Their drones can reach further and further behind the lines, giving the Ukrainians real headache with regard to logistically supplying Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. And then we have further gains, not huge numbers, but a little bit around Pokrovsk, Zaporozhye, and then further down the front line, according to Syriac maps, just south of Dachne there. Okay, so that's pretty much the Pokrovsk area. Then we're coming south, and you can see that the Russians have really put the pressure on here. Why have they put the pressure on here? You know, what is important about this area compared to anywhere else on the map? This area is their best chance of getting into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So if they can do that, rather like they've done previously during the beginning of the war, where they got a foothold in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, then they could say, right, these are Russian areas, we're going to write them into the constitution. And now that we have our feet in there, we own this place. That's kind of the Russian approach. Well, that's what they're doing with Dnipropetrovsk. They've so far not been in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, but what's been going on around particularly this neck of the woods, Dachne and Novoukrayinka and Zeleny Kut, is that across the river here, the Vovcha River, the next oblast starts. Well, not so much Novoukrayinka and Zeleny Kut. They are still within Donetsk, I think it is. But when you come up here around Dachne, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk. When you come up around Dachne, over the river here, then you are in Dnipropetrovsk. So Dachne has been a real crown jewel for the Russians over the last few days and week, because that's their ticket to getting Zaporozhye. So in the Kyiv Independent, we heard that Russia captures 2 villages near the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast border. Monitoring group says, and let's go and check that out. So, Russian forces have occupied the villages of Zeleny Kut and Novoukrayinka in Donetsk Oblast, located near the administrative border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The battlefield monitoring platform Deep State reported on the 5th. Russian forces are attempting to push further west, according to Deep State. Donetsk has been a central battlefield since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022 in Ukraine, while Dnipropetrovsk Oblast lies further west and has not seen significant Russian incursions. It is frequently targeted with missile, drone and aerial bomb strikes. So Russian troops have been escalating their assaults in the area and are attempting to breach into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The situation around Dachne is pretty intense, Deep State wrote on Telegram, referring to the nearby frontline settlement in the Oblast. Ukrainians have deployed reinforcements, but Russian units relying on numerical advantage and constant infantry assaults have breached some defences in the area, according to Deep State. So if we go back to the map, it's this Dachne area. Now, the latest is that has swapped hands again, and that is back under Ukrainian control. Ukrainian forces have pushed the Russian army out of Dachne days after it was occupied. Heroic actions, says War Monitor. And then finally we have some video evidence for this as well. So Dachne and Dnipropetrovsk, on July the 6th, soldiers from the 37th Separate Brigade of the 2nd Marine Battalion released a video from the settlement clearly showing the brigade's flag raised over Dachne, Dnipropetrovsk region. With this, they refuted Russian propaganda claims that the village was occupied. So there is evidence to suggest that Ukrainians do control the village of Dachne. So here on July the 6th, soldiers from the 37th Separate Brigade of the 2nd Marine Battalion released a video from the settlement clearly showing their brigade's flag raised over Dachne, Dnipropetrovsk region. With this, they refuted Russian propaganda claims that the village was occupied. I said that twice. Get myself confused. So that is good news, because you don't want to allow the Russians to have that kind of PR win here. These areas become quite symbolic, and there isn't any intrinsic utility in Dachne. But you can bet your bottom dollar that Russia will be fighting hard for it, and Ukraine will be fighting hard to defend it, so that it doesn't fall permanently to Russian hands, because that is their excuse to write Dnipropetrovsk into their constitution. But you can see there are some really significant advances over the 8 days here for the Russians. I mean, really, both mappers suggesting that the Russians have made some significant gains there, right up and down this whole sector. I don't think that there's anything else for us to look at with regard to this neck of the woods, other than, it's safe to say that this is a real problem for the Ukrainians. Some small gains around Malinivka there, a small village on that southern front line, not too far from Hlapale, which is receiving quite a lot of attention, it has to be said. And then we hear that Shebaki and Zaporozhye direction, the Ukrainians have taken back a little bit of land now, which actually Suret Maps agrees with. So there's Shebaki, close to Mali Shebaki, and not too distant from Kharkiv. But although there's a slight gain for the Russians around Malotokmachka, if you remember, Malotokmachka was where I think the Ukrainians lost quite a lot of vehicles in the initial assault in 2023, going down here towards Robotyne. Not a massive amount of change backwards recently, but the Russians are, they do seem to have the momentum in a number of these places on a smaller scale. Potentially having some larger momentum here as they're making gains on a wider basis on the front line along to Kupiansk and the Zaporozhye reservoir. So again, easy to say that there are concerns for the Ukrainians, but there are concerns for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been faring slightly better in some respects and in some places over the recent weeks and month or so. So Sumy Oblast is one where the Ukrainians have changed, they turned the tide there, and it seems to be somewhat more positive for the Ukrainians. But if the Russians have broken through in Kharkiv here, that is a concern. Ukrainians pushing back a little bit better in the northern part, the northeastern axis, so good news. And around Chasiv Yar, I think there's a bit of a worry. And although the Ukrainians pushing back in a number of places, I think the overall direction of travel for the Russians in really the rest of the front line, right down to the southern front line, is not good news for the Ukrainians. So there you go. That's enough from me. Hopefully that was of use. Thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate your support. The 8 days have seen quite a bit of movement this time round, and most of it going in Russia's favour. Take care. Speak soon.